Hello, and welcome to this session from wherever you're joining us today. Now, no conference today can be complete without a session on environment, social, and governance, collectively referred to as ESG. And over the last few years, we've witnessed an explosion of interest from a wide range of stakeholders, from shareholders, employees, debt investors, lenders, banks, governments, and regulators. Given the interest in ESG, many companies have had to develop their own responses across a wide range of different ESG components. And this is not easy, as the costs involved can be quite significant, and there are such a wide range of standards, it makes it difficult to address concerns of the various interested parties. Now, 2021 will be an important year for ESG, as the UK hosts COP26 and China hosts COP15, focused on biodiversity. It's also the fifth meeting after the Paris Accord, and campaigners will be looking for governments to increase targets for reduction in carbon emissions, complete agreements on carbon pricing, and also question whether enough has been done since Paris. Now, why should companies build an ESG strategy, and how can trade play its role? Our panelists today will share their own unique perspective on this topic, and we hope give you some food for thought and how you too can make your companies more sustainable in the long run. Now, before we start, I'd like you to answer this simple poll question, and you can find the poll next to the chat, the Q&A, and the notes section. I'd like you to think about how important a priority ESG is to your company over the next 5 years, and you can choose between high, medium, and low. Now, whilst we're waiting for you to respond, a reminder of some housekeeping. We're really keen to make this session as interactive as possible, so please do post your questions via the Q&A panel to the right of your screens. There's also a chat function on which comments can be posted for follow-up discussions with our panelists. And a reminder, the session is live, but will be made available on demand shortly afterwards, with all sessions on the platform being available to view for up to 6 months after the event. Now, whilst we're still running the poll, I'd like to go through the introductions. My name is Naresh Aggarwal, and after 30 years working in Treasury, I now provide policy and technical support at the Association of Corporate Treasurers in the UK, and an area of focus for me is ESG. Now, in alphabetical order, I'll ask my fellow panelists to briefly explain who they are, the company they work for, and then ask them to share a couple of ideas on what ESG means to them, as well as thoughts on the poll. Anil, turning to you first.
Thank you, Naresh. Thank you, GTR, for giving me this opportunity. I am Anil Jena. I am the country treasurer for Olam in India. Olam is a global food and agri supply chain and product producing company. Olam is engaged mostly from field gate to factory gate, and slowly also we are doing a backward integration going into farming. Olam is world's largest corporate farmer as on date, and on forward integration, we also are entering into consumer space on food. Olam's motto has been to reimagine the global agriculture. So what we mean by reimagine is sustainability as at the core of our business. We have already harped into an idea of there is a program that we have introduced. We call it at source. It has 3 levels. At source basically links the final produce to the producer. So any food you buy, if it has a at source label, that means we can definitely link you to who has produced it, how it has been procured, how it has reached to the consumer. At source has 3 levels, like I said. It is at source plus, at source infinity, and depending upon the level of sustainability built around it. At source infinity, which is the highest level of the program, aims to make the complete chain and complete environmental positive impact at a landscape level. So everything natural resources we use for that production has to be a positive, net positive impact on the landscape level. So our goal is to make 100% of the produces that we handle at source by 2025, excluding exchange traded products. We also in India are doing a lot of sustainable link produces. We are recently we have started a sustainable rice procurement from Haryana, about 30 villages encompassing 10,000 hectares is covered under this program, which aims at a 30 parameter environmental impact study, which will get a third-party audit with all those 30 parameters, and depending upon the completion of all the parameters, there will be a score awarded. Already a lot of multilateral organizations are associated, like IFC is already associated with it. We also are working upon few banks to engage or be a partner in that sustainable program.
That's brilliant.
We are already working a lot in this sustainability. As we proceed forward, I will further touch upon. Thank you, and have a nice panel discussion on GTR.
Thank you, Anil. Lisa, turning to you.
Sorry, I just had to unmute myself, so I apologize. So our organization is focused on building out capacity and standards frameworks to help particularly small to medium enterprises to access global value chain opportunities through breaking down barriers and reducing trade facilitation barriers. Hope that's enough for you. I'm going to keep it short and sweet. But it's all about helping those businesses to enter into those opportunities.
That's brilliant. Mayank, turning to you next.
Thanks, Naresh, and thank you, Anil and Lisa, for your views. As a quick introduction, I am responsible for the trade business for South Asia, which for us is India, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. First, responding to the poll question, how critical is ESG to the firm? I would say high, very high, if that were an option. Citi has been at the forefront, a pioneer of sorts in putting together, developing frameworks, globally consistent frameworks around ESG, be it partnering and leading the industry associations, speaking about the amount of carbon credit reductions, amount of carbon emission reductions in our own business, as well as speaking about how can we help finance green products. In fact, a few years back, we set up and promised that we would disperse $100 billion of green finance into the market by 2023. We are running ahead of that game. We've already disbursed about $95 billion of this amount, and we should reach this target well before time. This, I'm told, saves about 4.5 million liters of carbon dioxide emissions, equivalent to about 800,000 passenger cars running. In fact, one additional thing, we have a new CEO, Jane Fraser, who took on the role on the 1st of March. The first announcement she made was by 2050, we would be net zero emissions of greenhouse gases, and joins a very select list of companies to have made that commitment. A final comment from my end, I guess for sustainability to be sustainable, it has to be long-term value accretive. It has to leave the planet where it was, if not safer. It also has to generate value for the various stakeholders involved, companies, employees, customers, investors, banks, etc. And I'm a firm believer that ESG will act as a competitive advantage to companies and stakeholders when they get their act right. A lot has to happen. The market's nascent. A lot of policy frameworks have to form in place. But I guess that's for later. For now, I stand very bullish in this whole initiative. Naresh, over to you.
Thanks, Mayank. And finally, Anbu, turning to you.
Me? Yeah. Naresh, thank you and good evening, everybody. And my name is Venkatachalam. I work for ERIA, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. We are based in Jakarta, but we are working for the 16 economies in the region, including India. And basically, we provide the policy advice to the government and the private sectors under the three broader areas of one is this economic integration, particularly focusing on the trade and the non-tariff barriers. And the second is the narrowing the developmental gaps across the countries as well as within the countries. And third one is the sustainable development. Our works on India is focused on three areas. One is this globalization of these low carbon technologies from the perspective of Paris Agreement. That is how these technologies, how this liberalization of trade will help the countries to achieve the Paris Agreement targets. The second one is we are working on the financing the circular economy, basically improving the resource efficiency at the farm level. And we do basically here we find that is how this synergy could be developed within the digital technologies and this resource efficiency. Third area that is we are working with the focus is on the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Basically, we are currently analyzing how the countries and the companies can come together, and so that is this 2030 agenda is achievable and it is a profitable all. Basically, that is what we have been doing, and we also do capacity building program on the trade facilitation and the trade finance. And another area that is we are currently working is the public finance and the private finance. That is the crowdfunding for these climate actions.
Wow.
Thank you, Naresh.
Sounds like a lot going on. You're sort of working with. So first of all, thank you all for sharing your thoughts. And I can already see that the area is a very broad one with a number of interrelated and I guess sometimes competing challenges. And it's great to hear people from the public, the private sector, but also the standard setting area. So I think this is a really interesting group of folks. Just looking at the poll, one of my personal observations is it's great that no one has said they're low priority. My own personal experience is that whilst we all want to think it's a high or a medium priority, I'd like to challenge most companies that are participating, whether they truly are implementing ESG at these sort of levels, because my personal experience is a lot of people are really just doing some lip service to ESG. So my challenge to everyone here, everyone joining us, is really, when you say it's a high or a medium priority, what does that really mean for your company and your communities? And that's a challenge I'm going to leave you with. But what I'd like to go on to now is, if we all think it's quite important, I'd like to think about some of the obstacles we see facing a wider adoption of ESG activities in India. And Anil, I'd like to turn to you first.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, thanks, Naresh. So where I left, I would like to rejoin from there. So what is sustainability? Basically, if you see, even in recent times, going through the pandemic, we all have understood we can't the humans can't take out whatever necessary from the human mother nature and without any so why sustainability? Even we started it quite early. We understand that agriculture is a high resource utilizing activity. So our aim, we have defined three major goals where sustainability need to be done. One, I would say, is prosperous farmers and food systems. So if the producer is not prosper, obviously we can't expect the farming to continue as it is and continue to give us food and fiber. The second is thriving communities. Obviously, when you have a community who are engaged in agriculture, which is a low rewarding, a lot of times the rewards are pretty low. So everyone who is engaged in utilizing that final produce needs to also look at how to thrive the community that are producing for us. The third item is regeneration of the living world. As we all understand, due to the undiscriminate usage of natural resources, we have destroyed a lot of living organism or living world. We have skewed the nature's equilibrium. So all these things are core of our sustainable food systems. So as you can understand, all these things won't come cheap, because the way we are using, we all know, my fellow panelists and all those viewers of GTR would know, understand, by undiscriminate farming, we are degenerated the soil, we have brought the water table down, we have also done a lot of greenhouse emission to the environment. So if we want to do a sustainable farming, it will come at a cost. So in that case, basically what we are trying to do is engage with all the stakeholders. The stakeholders include the banks who finance the agri activities that we do, the end consumers. So the end consumers should be willing to bear a part of the cost of a sustainably produced food or fiber, right? So that is where we feel a lot of discussion, support has to come from the society, from the government, from the non-government organizations. So that is where we can actually lead towards. I do not need to emphasize upon that everybody now understands we need to sustain the human population by giving back to the nature. So that is what we are already working upon. And obviously, through this discussion, through this panel, through this opportunity, I would like everyone who are involved to also think through and be part of this sustainable development of food and fiber.
So, Anil, just picking up on one of the things that you've said, you've talked about not bearing the overall cost of implementing ESG on your own company, but actually sharing and spreading it across your supply chain. And right. You mentioned your banks as well playing a key role. Mike, this is a good segue into you and some of the obstacles you think, either as a bank or as corporations like Olam, they face and the role that the banks can play.
No, thank you, Naresh. And I think Anil gave a very good practitioner's view to the challenges that exist in this entire space. If I were to just take a step back and speak about this as a bank, ESG will bring about a disruption, right? It's going to be disruption like no other. We've seen and heard of companies in the energy space, in the oil refining space, now saying that we are committed to zero emissions in the next 10-20 year time frame, which will mean that they have to completely do a volte-face on their strategy and start thinking about renewables. So the point that I'm trying to make is ESG will cause a significant shift in the way companies used to do business for them to really bring about large-scale change. And it's very pleasing to note that Olam and other companies are making that change. However, I mean, if I think back to India, we've had numerous conversations with a lot of companies on the ground in India. And I would probably say that Olam's a handful of them that have actually made that effort and have made that effort to transition into a more sustainable development, into building more sustainable development goals. I think obstacles are manifold, right? Anil spoke of the need for consumers to absorb a part of the value chain, to absorb a part of the cost, right? Honestly, I think at this stage, I would expect industry associations, regulators, governments to start from forming frameworks that can help measure that can help incentivize and that can help regulate some of these things. Today, it is a very company-specific activity. It depends on companies prioritizing it. It depends on companies driving it. It depends on banks actually doing it. For this to be sustainable, like I said, it has to be a value accretive business. Otherwise, this will remain lip service and on paper and not see light of the day. So, as I think of the obstacles, I would say a framework that can capture and standardize some of these things. Greater partnership between governments and regulators along with the industry players will go a long way in defining what the incentive structure around all of this ought to be.
Mayank, that's really interesting. In fact, I'm going to change the order. I'm going to ask Lisa to sort of chime in now, because you've talked about the need for regulators, for governments, and sort of the challenge around some of these global standards. And Lisa, I think this is an area you really focused on. It'd be really great to hear your thoughts about how this manifests itself in Southeast Asia and for a lot of the folks listening in to this webinar.
Yes, thank you so much. And yeah, we do focus more on the standard side of things and the need to have, I guess, both an industry standards framework that is also semi-adopted by government, because one of the things that we're trying to do when we look at how do we incorporate ESG standards into a standards index that also covers other stuff in the trade finance world, which we're also trying to look at, is the need for an overarching standards index and a standards framework that is adopted. And that is both, the problem is it's both by the private sector and by government. So we want to ensure that anything that we're looking to achieve is going to be something that could be adopted by both organizations. But ultimately, I do think that that's where we need to end up. We're not advocating for any one organization to deliver anything. What we're trying to do is simplify this down and have a framework and an adopted standard that covers not just the ESG element, which I think is really important, but other elements as well.
Because one of the things, Lisa, that I find really, really challenging as an ex-treasurer is there are so many, we hear the story, there are so many different standards, there are so many different frameworks. And if I'm sitting here listening to this talk and hearing about another sort of bloody standard that I need to follow, and now you're telling me I need to actually also think about not just ESG, but other things as well. Could you give us, one of the choices I could have is maybe let me wait until the standards settle down and then I can engage, because otherwise I'm spending a lot of time on standard A, and then I find the world has actually started to adopt standard C. So maybe I'm better off just doing nothing until standard C is codified, established. We hear about things like EU taxonomy. Should we wait until the standards settle down?
Not really, because I think the problem is that we need to really look at standards in general in terms of where are they actually serving corporate interests and where are they serving maybe private sector interests, if I can be really quite honest, because a lot of standards are industry sector standards that are serving industry bodies and they generate a lot of money out of it. And it's not that I'm actually saying that they aren't important, because I do think they're important. That's why ESG standards are so important, because what do consumers want? They want to buy products that they know have these certain standards behind them. But why do we have to have 5,000 different certification bodies that sort of exist behind one standard, for example? That's where we've got to the crazy part. And what we're trying to do is sort of say, well, let's index the best index of standards and try to get to a point where we can simplify down an index of standards where we take the best practice of everything that is what consumers and the finance industry wants as well, because let's be honest, the finance industry is also looking at all of these different metrics. and simplify it down and say we don't need to have like all of these different like multitude of bodies. What we need is just this and this as a metrics, and this will be accepted. So that's where we are trying to push everybody to go to. I think it's sort of, for some people, it seems like it's not achievable because it seems quite high as an ambition. But I think, like everything else, you know, you take these steps and we can achieve it, because in essence, what we're trying to achieve is to make it more acceptable for SMEs to enter into global value chains without a lot of these burdens, and then actually take the burden away from, for example, the banking industry to do all of the regulation. If they were able to know that these were trusted people, trusted businesses, they don't have to do the regulation themselves.
I think that's a really good point. And I think the only thing that I would add to that is I think it's my daughter who said we're better off being doing something today and getting it 70% right than waiting 10 years. She's only 16, but waiting 10 years to get it completely right, when we know, honestly, we'll never get it completely right. So
yes, I agree with you, but I also deal in the world of like the WTO. So I know that some things won't happen right now, but you know, to be honest, maybe it's the private sector that takes it up and will do it faster, because often actually the private sector takes things up faster. And so maybe it's the private sector that drives this.
Okay, I think we're going to come back to Mayank on this. But Anbu, can I just pick up with you around some of the obstacles that you say companies facing? And you're on mute, Anbu.
Sorry, Naresh. And here, I think this ESG and sustainability, I think we are simplifying the complex things. And here we need to understand the situation in India. And India has this 3-generation environmental challenges. First one is the land use changes, and all these infrastructure activities that is now happening has an impact on the land use change. And the second is this pollution, the water pollution and the air pollution. That is a kind of a 2nd-generation problem. And third generation problem is this climate change and this resource efficiency. Lisa mentioned about the multiple standards. Why these multiple standards exist? For example, advanced economies has solved all these problems. For example, take the case of Germany and Japan. They first solved this 1st-generation problem, then they moved into the next generation. That now they are tackling this 3rd-generation environmental problem together. That is really a challenge for emerging economies. The main obstacles for here, I can see there are 3 areas. One is that is information asymmetry. And most of this information about that sustainability or the environmental, it's rested with the government sector. And the private sector knows it, but they absorb it in a way that is they want. Basically, and the consumers, they don't know about this information, where that lies. Basically, the first obstacle is that information asymmetry, I can say, between the regulator, between the private sector, and the consumers. And the second thing is the access to the technologies. We know there is a country that has already solved many of the problems. With this available technologies, India could easily solve the problem, but this access to the technologies, in case of energy efficiency, the small end of technologies, we need to find an innovative financial models or the business models. Third thing is the finance. Still, basically, both the consumers and the private sector thinks that is this public finance will be coming in.
Seems like we're having some problems with Anbu's connection. Sorry, Anbu, we got as far as the role of the finance sector.
Yeah, and the third one is what type of innovative financing mechanism that is we need. And here, I think for example, the energy efficiency. That is a low-hanging fruit. Basically, it is a business case where there is funding will become flowing in. But if you go for the renewable energy, they need to compete with this more fossil, but much more cheaper, but not clean fuels. They need to compete with it. This is the internal rate of return for these renewable energy projects are much lower when compared to this fossil fuel. So there is a viability gap. Who is going to fill it? And that is where that is the
Anbu, I think we're going to, I appreciate there's some challenges connecting through to Indonesia. Maybe what I'll do is I think one point around financing. And maybe, Mayank, this is a good opportunity.
We need to think about the risk sharing mechanisms. I think that is where that is the more public and private partnership is needed. So
we're going to try and get a better connection into Anbu. But in the meantime, Mayank, Anbu referred a bit about the sort of financing area. And just more broadly, what I want to cover in the next section is we've talked a lot around the costs involved. And as Anil mentioned, it's not going to be cheap. But can there are some benefits to doing this, to embracing ESG from a financial perspective. Could you tell us about some of these benefits of why organizations should be embracing ESG?
Sure, Naresh. And as I think of ESG that's developing globally, starting from maybe countries in Europe and then to North America and coming all the way to Asia, I can't help but think of the commonalities that exist with something that's slightly unique to India, which is the whole priority sector lending business. The government, about a decade or so back, created the regulations around priority sector lending and made it binding upon banks such as Citi to have a certain percentage of their asset book given out to clients and companies that meet certain minimum threshold, right? Micro, small, and medium enterprises, agricultural companies, farmers, etc. And given how this was developed and launched and tracked and monitored, I would like to say that this has been more successful than not. A lot of banks have been able to build out their own organic origination of priority sector lending, priority sector lending assets. Now, I'm not saying that priority sector lending overlaps perfectly with ESG, but there are commonalities between the two, and that could be a good segue. And one of the reasons priority sector lending was successful was there was a benefit to companies that could create structures that could meet the priority sector lending norms. Those benefits were in the form of larger pool of credit. They were in the form of differential interest rates. So there was, through market evolution and government nudges, incentives built in for both the financial institutions and the borrowers. And this partnership worked very well and helped get this to a stage. As I think of the benefits as I think of the learnings that we could transpose into ESG, I would say that a lot of them will be similar. How do you incentivize the value chain? How do you incentivize the financial institutions? More can be done so that this becomes sustainable and it becomes an integral part of their competitive advantage, their long-term strategy. And as various stakeholders that Lisa spoke of and Anbu spoke of, as the public-private partnership, as the regulators come together, I'd like to see more work being done here. I mean, to my mind, for ESG to be successful in a company, it is a wide-ranging effort, starting from the board right down to the supply chain. But I would say that the role of a treasurer is as powerful as any other guy in the company, because he's the one that's going to navigate this towards sustainable finance, and that's when some of the advantages will start accruing. Of course, there are things like consumer paying the price for some of this, but that's how I'd like to think of the evolution around it. And banking has tried to keep up pace. We started off with green bonds. The market's pretty vibrant, if I can say. There is a class of investors that's there. The market's evolving. There are now green deposit, green loans, green guarantees. We're now moving to green supply chain finance, etc. So the market's evolving very rapidly, and the financial institutions are trying to keep pace. But some of these infrastructural frameworks, etc., need to be put in place for this to keep going. The benefits are plenty.
And I'm just picking up on one of the questions was around, I'll just read it out. Many SMEs and MSMEs are facing huge challenges, and what incentives are the government looking to promote sustainable business activity? And I'm just listening. I guess part of the answer to that presumably is the priority sector lending.
Yeah, so priority sector lending actually does solve for some of this for sure. And wherever there is a fairly tight definition of what classifies as priority sector. So as long as some of these entities classify within this definition, there's definitely advantages under the priority sector regulations. But as ESG gets more center of plate, I would think that it has the potential to dwarf and outgrow even priority sector lending. Okay.
So as well as the financing benefits of embracing ESG, Anil, could you talk to us a bit more about, as a company, what it means for your customers, your suppliers, why you think it's useful embracing a sort of broad ESG agenda?
Yeah, sure, Naresh. So actually, I would like to touch upon what Lisa mentioned earlier and then Mayank. So I also am of the opinion, and I would agree with Lisa, there has to be a standardization because having a multiple organizations who audit and certify will confuse everyone from the financier to the end consumer. So it is high time that we have a standardization on ESG similar to the say for the global climate group. And standardization will help in everyone understanding what if it is X is X, right? So the ambiguity actually does not help anyone. That is definitely something to look at. Second, I do agree with Mayank that some sort of, so maybe priority sector lending can be a starting point, but not the end point. The end point has to be much larger. And priority sector can be just to take back how we have achieved, how India has achieved the priority sector lending by through priority sector lending to reach out to a lot of unbanked, unfinanced areas by this directional lending. But ESG, I would say, does not have a role that is limited to a country's boundaries. Because it has a much more wider ramification than something like, say, providing finance to someone who is unbanked, right? So it is a much larger scope. Now coming back again, by just financing or subsidizing finance, this will not solve. It is a much larger concept. So obviously what I had touched upon earlier, the end users, the consumers also need to be bear a part of the burden. So how we solve that as a company? What we are trying to do is by employing technology. If a consumer is certain about how the good is produced, how it has really impacted the environment, which can be verified through technology. So what if we have a barcode where you scan and you can see how much water this product has used, how much carbon it has emitted, how much greenhouse it has used. So obviously that will encourage people to come forward and support. Now what is happening is very small scale or a very directed ESG say lending or USD buying good companies ahead of the curve companies are using it. But to make it a mass, we definitely need to use technology and digital, maybe the blockchains, where there can be a verifiable ledger where you can see all these products and saying is ESG compliant or sustainably procured, are they really? You can always go and verify. So confidence gives more resource, and confidence actually will help in grow this.
Okay, super. I'm sort of mindful we've got about 5 minutes left. So what I'm going to ask is actually, we were going to talk a bit about technology, but I think you've all talked a little bit about technology in some of your responses. So I'm going to turn to, the final questions about E and S and G. And I'd like you to think about and tell us your own views as what are S and G and how important they are. And I'm going to have to limit you to probably no more than a couple of minutes on each. So Anbu, maybe if I can turn to you first. What is S and what is G?
Yes, and here I think we know that is this social inclusion. I think that is more important, and here we need to see that is the two basically segments of the economy. One is this small and medium enterprises. If you think to these companies and how we can take them in the journey towards sustainability. That is more about the social, because these SMEs are the social fabric of communities. And second thing is this job generation. This is ESGI and here how these initiatives can bring more jobs, more green jobs, or more safe jobs. I think that component that is not yet well defined in this ESG debates. And third one is the governance. Governance is, from our perspective, basically it is inclusivity and also it is reflective of the community's aspirations or the country's global commitments. For example, coming to the Paris Agreement or the SDGs. So this is the governance structure, and basically without the participation of the private sector and the consumers, the government cannot act alone. And here that is where we need to learn from some of the advanced countries like Japan and Korea. Basically, about 50 or 60 years back, their system or their governance structure is more similar to India. But how they're progressive and how this aspirations of the communities and the private sector has get reflected into this regulatory framework. I think that is where that is we need and where India need to look into it.
Okay, super. Lisa, can I turn to you next?
In terms of thinking about all of the ESG angle, I'm not going to go into the S and the Gs. I think it should all be inclusive, to be honest with you, as we just celebrated International Women's Day as well. Everything is inclusive. It should all be about things being inclusive. And from that perspective, for the economy in India, I try to look at it from an economic macro perspective, in that investing in clean energy, clean infrastructure, clean technology, it creates jobs, and it creates the future economic jobs that we need for the future, particularly as most economies are coming out of a very bad period because of COVID. So we should see environmental standards or investing in infrastructure that is, I say, let's invest in infrastructure that's clean and green and technology, and that includes services that support that. This is what all economies should be doing right now, because we need to find a way to reinvigorate the economy out of the current situation that it's in, and this is the future that we need to invest in.
Okay, that's brilliant, Lisa. Thank you. Mayank, you've got about a minute and a half.
So, I mean, my thoughts on this are that inclusion is really three forms, right? There is diversity, there is equity, and then there is the whole concept of inclusion, right? In a country like India, environment for sure is important, but given the workforce, given the diversity, given how you have companies, sectors, communities that have completely missed the growth that's happening in the broader economy, it is imperative that people start to think about it. We've now started to talk about diversity of the board, diversity of the senior management. People are measuring women in workforce, but it has to go far beyond that. And I don't think we are there yet. But as the ESG agenda takes center stage, I'm confident that not just environment, but the others, the S and the Gs will also be given equal priority.
Super. Anil, you've got about a minute.
Yeah. So I also touched upon, S is the core of our business. So by society, we mean the communities. So like I said, without the development of communities, no development can happen. So we consider it as the core of any activity. And of course, governance is important because when we said or we say that we need to develop the communities, it has to be in a governed a particular way and should be auditable, should be verifiable. So we feel it is equally important. So we don't only look at environment, we also look at the societies around the environment. If you don't develop the societies or communities, obviously protection of the environment can't take place. So we feel it is very much important.
That's brilliant. Well, we've come to the end of the session, and I'd like you each to share one final thought for the audience. But before we do that, I just want to give you some of the questions we've had. One is, and maybe you want to reflect this in your own responses. What do you see as a reason for Indian companies not taking ESG seriously as expected? With Industry 4.0 revolution, the world's moving towards adapting Trade 4.0. Indian banks are still not able to achieve expected digital adoption. How should we go about this? And then someone asked about fintechs being active in the Indian market and how many of those are putting ESG at the heart of their business proposition. So I'll leave you whether you want to respond to that or just provide your own final thoughts to people listening in. Anil, can I start with you?
Yeah, so we understand any one company or any one group can't make the change, which is a large social change. Everyone needs to be aware and contribute their part. And of course, like I said, government, semi-government, non-government organization, everyone needs to be seriously looking at the environmental impact of what we are consuming, what we are resources we are using from the nature. High time we look at it more seriously than we have done till now.
Super. Lisa.
Well, I would say that global supply chains are shifting right now. And therefore, if Indian companies want to get ahead of the opportunity, I would say embrace this opportunity and use it. And it's going to be a competitive advantage for you in the future. Therefore, it's a massive business opportunity. And I would say go for it, embrace it. Supply chains are shifting, take advantage.
Super. Mayank?
Yes, I think I'll echo in part what Anil said, that ESG is in its infancy in India. Some of it is about how the country itself is in its journey towards evolution and getting toward developed country status. Some of it is about awareness, and it is today incumbent upon an individual company to embrace this goal. I would think the day is not far when the governments would be nudging companies, incentivizing companies to take on more in this space, because the Indian government has shown through multiple ways that it believes in a public-private partnership as it thinks of some of the most strategic goals. I'm certain that the day is not far when the government is nudging companies into taking on more, doing more. And they've done that in the past, right? Corporate social responsibility. The government is working with the private sector into Partnering in long-term growth. We had the priority sector lending example. I have no doubt that this partnership will broad base into ESG, and I'm certain that it will be successful. India will be the flag bearer over the next few years on this whole ESG agenda.
Super, brilliant. Anbu, 1 minute for you, if I can.
Sure, and my last word is the world is moving very fast, and India need to catch up. I think take the case of China. It has already said that's a net zero economy by 2060. And it is Japan has already announced zero carbon economy by 2050, and Korea is already there. Their stimulus is a new Korea clean deal, and basically, so India need to. I think there is no waiting game. And for me, and from that perspective, and ESGI is a kind of purchase order from the future. So that is how I look at it from the company perspective. So they need to change the business model. So there are two things that is needed. One is they need to continuously innovate, and this is the kind of secret for the success for all the corporates. Thank you.
That's great. So I hope you've all enjoyed the session, and I've found a few things to take back to your organizations. I've certainly learned a great deal from our panelists, and it's given me a better appreciation of the work that India has already taken on ESG. The Priority Lending Program is a great example of how the country's been fulfilling part of an ESG program well ahead of other nations, other advanced nations. And for me personally, as someone whose parents were born in India, it makes me incredibly proud the country is already ahead of many others in this area. But I do take Anbu's comment that the challenge, you can't rest on your laurels. We have to work harder and faster in this space. I've also taken away some of the words, Lisa's words around inclusive. And Anil talked about us all being engaged. And I think from my own perspective and sitting here in the UK, very aware that if for the legislation to force you to make a change, it's going to be very, very painful. These changes take a while to do it properly, and getting ahead of the curve is really incredibly valuable. And as Lisa said, it's a great opportunity. This is not just about, encumbering yourself with a lot of costs. There's some real financial benefits, as well as a feeling of doing something better for our planet as well. So I'd like to thank my fellow panelists, Anil, Lisa, Mayank, and Anbu for their insights. Thank you very much for your questions. I know we didn't get them all done. Hopefully we've covered a lot of them during our session. Please do feel free to get in touch with the panelists through the platform. And as mentioned before, this session will be available on demand shortly, and you will be able to access it for up to 6 months after the event finishes. I've really enjoyed the last couple of days. I found some really useful things that I've taken away and learned about India. I hope you've all enjoyed what I think has been a really enjoyable summit. I'm really looking forward to doing this one in person, so you don't have some of the technology challenges. And I just want to say thank you. Have a great rest of the day. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.